and we are honored to present my friend Ammon Bundy and the People's Rights with this last and final Defender of Freedom Award. God bless you, my brother.
Thank you. Thank you, Diego. I guess I'm standing here simply because, in a lot of ways, because of you. And it does show that the power of the people coming together is a very powerful thing. And I'll explain myself. So first, in 2014, when my father, after a long legal battle with the federal government, decided that he was not going to lose his ranch, that ranch had been passed on to him, and he was the fifth generation, that it was established in 1877, and that his desire to provide a commodity to the American people out of the desert, red meat, was his right to do. And so he stood, and he stood alone primarily, I guess, with a little bit of our support as his children and family, but he stood. And eventually, after quite some time, 213 armed men from five different federal agencies came with their MRAMs, their helicopters, their communication towers, and they surrounded my family's ranch, put snipers on the hills, and threatened us that if we resisted in any way, that this would be another Waco or Ruby Ridge. Now my mother began to just post what was happening, film, take pictures. My sister's the same, of the snipers on the hill, and they began to post it on mostly social media, but tell everybody they could. And eventually what happened, after a tremendous, I guess, almost physical resistance, where people were thrown to the ground, tased, or over 60 head of cattle were killed, water infrastructure that was over 100 years old was destroyed. Eventually, thousands of people came to the ranch, and many of you are here today. And they literally surrounded my family and insisted that these federal agents leave the area immediately. And I saw a miracle that day. I saw a miracle that I never thought was ever going to be possible. In fact, at the beginning of that week, it looked more like my family was going to die standing for liberty. But on April 12th, 2014, I watched thousands of people insist that these federal agents leave. And because of that, they left within 1 hour. You have never seen such a scene where hundreds of federal vehicles lined up and left immediately the area, where they abandoned all of their equipment, just left it, all because of the power of the people. And I learned something that day that I will never forget, that I have tried to speak and tell everybody that I could. And that is, when one person says no, and when that person is right, and when thousands come to surround, there is no way that liberty can be lost. Now that event perpetuated into another. Again, because of a poor law, a ranching family in Harney County, Oregon, was facing the very same thing that my family was facing. And although I didn't want to, I wanted to stay home with my family. I did not want to get caught up into somebody else's trouble. But I had learned that lesson. And where much is given, much is expected. And so I knew I had to act. And I did the best I could to bring as much national and international attention to the Ammon family as I could. In fact, under the criticism of many, I knew that what it was going to take was something pretty extreme. And so I went, and many of my friends and others went into the National Wildlife Refuge, in Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, and we began to bring as much attention to the atrocities to the Ammon family as we could. And that ultimately transpired into my incarceration. And then my fathers and brothers and many friends, in fact, some called it a blood prosecution because so many of us of the same family was being prosecuted under the same accusations. And what I experienced there in prison was a terrible thing, but I also learned a tremendous amount of lessons. And also I learned how important it was to be able to decide what and how precious it is to be able to get up in the morning and decide what you're going to do with your day. To get up and decide where you're going to work, what you're going to do, how you're going to react, who you're going to worship, what you're going to eat. All of those things became very, very precious to me. And I realized how terrible it is to every day get up and not be able to decide what you're going to do with your time, not be able to decide what you're going to eat, not be able to decide, how you're going to help your family. And so it became very, very real to me how precious freedom is. And I can't emphasize enough to you the need to be able to decide and to be able to have that liberty and to be able to share that with your family. Now, I hesitate telling you this story, but about half of my incarceration I spent in solitary confinement. I spent months and months on end, which of course, as many of you know, is illegal, even in their own rules. But I spent hundreds of days consecutive in solitary confinement. And the reason why that, or at least their excuse was, because I would not submit to a strip search. Because I would not submit, they would throw me in solitary confinement for months on end, until it got to the point where they were not even transporting me to my own trial. They started trial without me. And finally the judge said, we can't continue to have trial without him, or the circuit courts will just throw it out as a mistrial. So it wasn't until then they decided, I guess on their own, to crack the door of solitary confinement and allow me to go to my own trial. Now I tell you these things because it is a reality that there are people out there that have tremendous power that will take away your liberties. They will strip you of them. When you look, go on the internet and just look at the pictures of the Holocaust. And it always amazes me how you see pictures of men and women stripped completely naked, lined up, and facing a mass grave where they're shooting them in the back of the head and falling in the grave. Now, what is so amazing to me is that why would they line up and knowing what is at the end of the line? Why? Why would they line up? Now, the answer to that is not easy, but it is this. And I have been there, and I know for a fact that this is true. That when you have faced so much tyranny in your life, there is a point where you would rather line up naked and get shot in the head. And my friends, why we're here today right now is to make sure that never happens. Now, you must backtrack a little bit and ask yourself, why did the Jewish people not, or how did they get in that position? How were they there? And I am not someone to be a judge of another people, but we must learn from history. And it was because they thought that putting their head down and trying to not be noticed was the better way. They thought that compliance would get them through it, that it was just a period of time that they might just pass through and end up better on the other end. And that is the decision that we have to make right now. Are we better to just comply? No. And why? Is it safer to comply? No, it is not. Because if you comply now, they will go further. And if you comply then, they will go further. And if you comply then, they will go further until we are lined up naked, facing a mass grave, being shot in the back of the head. And no one can say, oh, Ammon, that will not happen. Because guess what? It already has. It's happened many, many times. And in fact, 250 million people in the 21st century have been killed by their own government, murdered for many different reasons. And so now is the time, and I thank you for being here. Thank you for your time. And I have to say, I must say, to all the business owners out there, to all the people in Idaho, to all of you here and to all of you that may be listening, and even to all of you that will not listen or even hear this, you must stand. And you must open your businesses. You must. I've been a little long-winded, but I'm going to tell you one other example of this. The Constitution in the 1700s was drafted for our protection and security. In that Constitution, it established that all men were equal. That all men were equal. It established it by law, it established by document, and it was set forth. But the problem is that even during its ratification, there was groups of people in the United States of America, newly founded, that were not being treated equal, that were actually being treated as slaves. There was, and so even in the Constitution, where they actually considered a part of them as an equal vote. So they weren't being treated as equal. But the document set forth that all men were equal. And then we move on into 100 years later, almost 100 years later, and we have a civil war. And part of that civil war was about this issue of slavery, about all men not being equal. And so they set forth what we call the 14th Amendment. And in that 14th Amendment, it establishes that all people should be treated equal. Okay, that's what it does. That's what it said. All people should be treated equal. And so did we resolve the question? Did all people at that time, were all people treated equal at that time? No. But yet the law said, it established that all men were equal. An amendment was established that they should be treated equal. But then we find ourselves 100 years down the road, in the 1960s and so forth, where we have civil liberties of certain people that are fighting to be treated equal. And it was not until they decided that they were going to sit at the front of the bus, that they were going to go into the public bathrooms, that they were going to go to the colleges. It was not until they said themselves, we will be treated equal, that we will not be treated as slaves, and it was not until they decided that they were going to sit in the front of the bus, until finally the laws and the cultures and the people began to follow that. And that should be a lesson to us. There is no remedy that we will find in the Capitol building for our freedoms. There is no remedy that we'll find in the courts. The remedy is right here, and it is in your heart. And therefore, the business owners of this state must open up. They must open up. The people in the houses, the churches, the pastors, they must open up. They must exercise their liberty. And that is a reality. And I thank you for your time, and thank you for being here.